That key is garbage, Dad. You know that, right? Derek laughed, actually laughed, right there at the reading of my brother's will, and Christine put her hand over her mouth to hide her smile, but not well enough. The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when everyone agrees on something cruel without needing to say it out loud. Frank had left houses to two cousins, cash to a hospital, and to me. His only brother, the man who sat with him through 11 rounds of chemotherapy. One small, corroded key with no label and no explanation. But 2 weeks later, a bank manager I had never met called my cell phone at 7:40 in the morning and asked, in a voice that did not sound like routine business, if I could come in that same day. When I showed him the key, the color drained out of his face like water from a cracked glass, and he stood up, walked to the front of the branch, and locked the doors himself. My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is that for most of my life, I was the reliable one, the quiet one, the one people forgot to thank. I spent 41 years as a machinist and then a shop foreman at a tool and die company outside Dayton, the kind of job where your hands tell the truth about your life, even when your mouth doesn't. I raised two children with my late wife, Evelyn, in a house we paid off 11 years early because we never once bought anything we couldn't afford twice over. When Evelyn died of ovarian cancer 6 years ago, I did not fall apart in front of anyone. I planned her funeral on a Tuesday, buried her on a Saturday, and was back at church coffee hour helping stack chairs by the following Sunday, because that is what you do when you were raised by people who believed dignity was the last thing you were allowed to keep, and so you kept it, no matter what. When we were boys, Frank used to say, I was the one who read the instructions, and he was the one who just started turning the bolts, and our father used to laugh and say the house would burn down twice over if either of us were ever left alone to build anything by ourselves. We needed each other, he said, the way a lock needs a key, and neither one of us understood, at 9 and 11 years old, how literally that would turn out to be true. My younger brother Frank was the opposite of me in almost every way that people notice and almost identical to me in every way that matters. He was loud where I was quiet, reckless with money where I was careful, and yet underneath all of it, he had the same iron spine our father had, the same refusal to be pushed around by people who mistook his warmth for weakness. Frank made his fortune in commercial real estate, then lost most of it in 2009, then built it back slower and smarter over the next 15 years. He never married, never had children, and so when the pancreatic cancer diagnosis came 4 years ago, he leaned on me the way I once leaned on him when we were boys, sharing a bedroom the size of a closet in our parents' rented house on Corliss Street. I drove him to appointments. I sat in waiting rooms with magazines I never read. I held a plastic basin under his chin more times than any man should have to hold anything under his own brother's chin, and I never once complained, because that is not what brothers do, and because somewhere in the doing of it, I stopped being the older brother and became something closer to the last person on earth Frank fully trusted. My son Derek is 44 years old and has never once, in his entire adult life, asked me how I was doing without first telling me what he needed. That is not bitterness talking. That is simply an inventory, the kind I learned to keep after 4 decades on a factory floor where you write down what happened, not what you wish had happened. 3 years ago, Derek and Christine bought a house in a neighborhood they could not afford on a mortgage they qualified for only because I co-signed it, against my better judgment, against the quiet voice in my head that sounded exactly like Evelyn saying, Walter, you know how this ends. I have paid the difference on that mortgage, $620 a month, every month for 36 months. That is $22,320. I have paid for their daughter's braces $4,100. I paid for Christine's father's hip surgery when their insurance fell through, $11,000, because Derek called me crying. Actually crying, and I could not say no to my son's tears, even when I suspected, correctly as it turned out, that those tears were about convenience and not desperation. There is one more piece of the ledger I should mention, because it matters later. 2 years ago, Christine's sister needed a down payment for a car, and Derek asked me for $3,000 just to bridge things until payday. A phrase he used often enough that I should have noticed the pattern sooner than I did. I gave it to him without a second thought, the way I had given him almost everything else, because that is what my own father did for me once, long ago, when I was young and proud and too embarrassed to admit I was short on rent, and I never forgot the relief of not being questioned about it. I wanted to be that kind of father to my own children. A soft place to land, no interrogation attached. I did not yet understand that a soft place to land can also become a place people learn to fall into on purpose again and again, because they have discovered it will always be there to catch them, and that the falling stops looking like an accident after the third or fourth time. I am telling you all of this not to complain, but so that you understand exactly what kind of man was standing in that lawyer's office the day the will was read, and exactly what kind of silence settled into my chest when my own son laughed at the one thing his uncle had trusted me enough to leave in my hands. The pattern, if I am honest with myself, had been building for longer than I wanted to admit. It started small, the way these things always do. Derek stopped asking me to Sunday dinner and started only calling when something needed fixing, paying, or signing. Christine began referring to my house, the house Evelyn and I built our whole life inside of, as an asset, as in, Walter, have you thought about what happens to the asset when you're gone? I noticed that my granddaughter, Ruby, who used to run to the door when I visited, had started staying upstairs on her tablet unless her parents told her to come say hello, and that when she did come down, she looked at me the way you look at an ATM that occasionally malfunctions. I noticed that Derek had started calling Frank directly toward the end, without me, and that Frank had mentioned it to me once, carefully, the way you mention something you're not sure you should mention. Your boy's been asking me about my properties, Frank said, lying in that hospital bed with tubes running into the back of his hand like pale vines. Asking real specific questions, Walt, like he's doing math. I told Frank not to worry about it. I told myself the same thing. I was wrong on both counts. And some part of me, the part that had spent 41 years reading machines for the smallest sign of failure before they broke, already knew it. There were other small things, the kind you only see clearly once you've been given a reason to look back and count them properly. Christine had started, over the last year, mentioning offhand how hard it must be for me to keep up a house this size alone, always framed as concern, always landing on the same quiet suggestion that perhaps it was time to think about downsizing, about simplifying, about what made sense for the future. Derek had asked me, twice in 6 months, whether I had a current will on file and whether I'd ever thought about setting up power of attorney, just in case, questions that are not unreasonable on their own, questions a good son might ask out of genuine care, except that he never once asked them the way you ask out of care. He asked them the way you ask when you are trying to find out where the edges of something are before you decide how hard to push against them. And there was the Thanksgiving, 8 months before Frank died, when Derek had pulled me aside in the kitchen, ostensibly to talk about football, and steered the conversation instead toward Frank's health, how serious it seemed, how it might be smart for the family to get organized before things got worse. I remember feeling a small, cold flicker of discomfort at that conversation and then talking myself out of it within the hour. Because it is a terrible thing to suspect your own son of counting a dying man's remaining months, and it is easier, so much easier, to simply decide you must have misheard him. The day Frank died, in March, at 4:52 in the morning, I was the only one in the room. Derek had said he would come the next day. He did not make it in time, and when I called to tell him his uncle was gone, there was a pause on the line before he asked, not, "How are you, Dad?" Not, "I'm so sorry," but, "Did he say anything? About, anything specific?" I remember standing in that hospital hallway under the fluorescent lights, my brother's body still warm 2 rooms away, and feeling something crack quietly inside my chest that had nothing to do with grief for Frank and everything to do with grief for the son I thought I had raised. The will reading was 3 weeks later, in a conference room with a laminate table and a lawyer named Fitzgerald who kept clearing his throat like he was allergic to the room itself. Frank left his condo in Sarasota to our cousin's daughter, who had visited him faithfully for years. He left $40,000 to the oncology ward that had treated him. He left his 1967 Bronco to a mechanic he'd befriended, a young man named Tomas who had kept that truck running for a decade out of what I understood, later, to be genuine affection rather than obligation. And to me, his brother, the man who held the basin, who drove the miles, who sat in the dark, he left a single small key, rusted at the teeth, threaded onto a plain steel ring with no fob, no note, no bank name stamped anywhere on it. Fitzgerald read the line from the will out loud. To my brother Walter, who has given me more than I could ever repay, I leave this key and my trust that he will know, in time, what it opens. That was when Derek laughed. Christine smiled behind her hand. My daughter, Marianne, who lives 2 states away and had flown in for the reading, looked at me with something closer to pity than sympathy and said, "Dad, I'm sorry. That's kind of a strange way to go out." Nobody in that room, not one person, thought that key was worth anything but a joke. I put it in my coat pocket and said nothing, because 41 years on a factory floor teaches you something else besides how to keep records. It teaches you that the men who talk the least in a crisis are usually the ones who end up understanding it first. I want to be clear about something, because this part of the story surprises people every time I tell it. I did not think the key was valuable either. Not at first. I thought Frank, in his final months, on morphine and grief and fear, had simply left me a strange, sentimental gesture. A key to nothing. A metaphor without a lock. I put it in the drawer of my nightstand, next to Evelyn's wedding ring, which I have never been able to part with. And for 11 days, I mostly forgot about it, distracted instead by the practical avalanche that follows any death. Forwarding mail, canceling subscriptions, fielding condolence calls from people who had not spoken to Frank in a decade. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, coffee still too hot to drink, when my phone rang with a number I did not recognize, a local area code, and a voice on the other end introduced herself as Diane Marsh, branch manager of Colonial Trust and Savings on 5th Street, a bank I had never once in my life done business with. "Mr. Hendricks," she said, and there was something careful in her tone, the tone of someone choosing each word like it might detonate. "I apologize for calling so early. This concerns your late brother, Frank Hendricks. Would it be possible for you to come in today? In person. It's a matter that really can't be handled over the phone." I asked her what it was about. She said only that it involved a safe deposit box under Frank's name, one that had gone unopened and unpaid on its annual fee for over a year before his death, which the bank had been legally obligated to flag for eventual auction. A fact she mentioned almost in passing, as though she did not fully trust herself to say the rest of it yet. I told her I would be there within the hour. I did not mention the key. Some old instinct, the same one that had kept me quiet in that conference room while my son laughed, told me not to say a single unnecessary word to anyone until I understood what I was walking into. Colonial Trust and Savings was a squat brick building with brass fixtures that had clearly not been updated since the Carter administration, the kind of small, independent bank that survives by knowing its customers by name rather than by algorithm. Diane Marsh met me at the door herself. A woman in her 50s with steel gray hair pulled back tight and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. The kind of face that had clearly seen every version of human behavior a bank counter can produce and was rarely surprised by any of it. She was not smiling. She led me past the tellers, through a door marked Employees Only, down a short hallway, and into a small, windowless office where she asked me, gently but firmly, to sit down. "Do you have the key, Mr. Hendricks?" I took it out of my coat pocket and set it on the desk between us. Rusted teeth. Plain steel ring. No fob. Diane Marsh looked at it for a long moment, picked it up, turned it over once in her fingers to check something on the underside. A serial number, I would later learn, stamped so small you would need a magnifying glass to see it under normal light. and her face changed. It did not turn pale immediately. That came a moment later, after she matched the serial number against something on her computer screen. After she read whatever came up there twice, her lips moving slightly the way people's lips move when they are rereading something to make sure they haven't misunderstood it. Then she stood up, walked out of the office, and I heard, from down the hallway, the unmistakable sound of the branch's front doors being locked from the inside. The heavy metallic clunk of a deadbolt engaging, followed by the softer click of the security gate being pulled across the entrance. Two tellers I could see through the office's interior window exchanged a look. A customer at the counter said something I couldn't hear, and one of the tellers said something back, gesturing apologetically, and the customer left through a side door with the particular irritation of someone who has just been told the bank is closing early for reasons no one will explain. Diane Marsh came back into the office, closed the door behind her, and sat down across from me again, and this time when she spoke, her voice had dropped almost to a whisper, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "Mr. Hendricks, I need you to understand something before I say anything else. What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room until we have completed the proper legal steps. Do you understand me?" I said I did, though at that point I understood nothing at all, only that something in this small brick building had shifted the ground under both of our feet, and that my brother, 3 weeks in his grave, had somehow reached back from wherever he was and put a hand on my shoulder one last time. "Your brother," Diane said, "opened box 214 in this branch 11 years ago. He is the sole authorized holder, under the terms he set at the time. And this is unusual, Mr. Hendricks. I want to be honest with you. In 26 years at this bank, I have seen this exact clause perhaps twice. He specified that in the event of his death, the box could only be opened by the physical presentation of this exact key, matched against the serial record we keep on file, by a person he had separately and privately named, in a sealed letter held in our vault. Not by his executor. Not by a court order alone. Not by his will. By the key, and by the name in that letter." She paused. "The name in that letter is yours." I did not say anything for a moment. I could hear the ventilation system humming somewhere above the drop ceiling, could hear, faintly, one of the locked-out tellers laughing quietly at something on the other side of the door. Life going on in its small, oblivious way, while mine was quietly rearranging itself in a windowless room. "What's in the box?" I finally asked. "I don't know," Diane said. "I've never opened it. Nobody has, except your brother. And only he knows what's inside." "But Mr. Hendricks, the reason I called you personally, the reason I locked the front doors just now, is that under our internal protocol, any box holding contents above a certain declared insured value requires 2 officers present, a formal inventory witnessed and signed, and a level of institutional discretion I don't extend to ordinary safe deposit boxes. Your brother's box is insured under our commercial vault policy for an amount I am not permitted to disclose to you until the box is formally opened in front of witnesses and an attorney of your choosing. But I can tell you this much, because I think you deserve to know it before you decide whether to go forward today or wait and bring counsel. It is not a small number." I sat in that chair for what felt like a very long time, holding my brother's rusted key in my hand, thinking about a conference room 3 weeks earlier where my own son had laughed at this exact object, where my daughter had called it strange, where every person who was supposed to love me had looked at Frank's final gift and seen nothing but garbage. I thought about Derek's careful questions to a dying man about his properties. I thought about Christine calling my house an asset. And somewhere in that windowless room, something settled in me. Not excitement, not triumph, nothing so simple as that, but a kind of clarity. The same clarity I used to feel on the shop floor when a machine that had been running wrong for weeks finally showed you, plainly, exactly where the fault lay. I told Diane Marsh I would come back with an attorney, and that I did not want anyone, not my children, not any member of my family, informed of this call, this box, or this conversation until I said otherwise. She agreed without hesitation, and I understood, watching her write a note to that effect directly into the file in front of her, that she had handled exactly this kind of quiet, careful protection before for other people who had learned the hard way that some information needs walls around it before it can be safely released. I did not go home and call my children. I called Sam Petrosky instead. Sam and I had known each other for 38 years, since he represented the union in a dispute with my old employer, and I was the shop steward who sat across the table from management, arguing for men who could not argue for themselves. He had gone on to build a small but sharp estate and business law practice, the kind of firm that didn't advertise because it didn't need to, and he had been Evelyn's lawyer when we wrote our own wills 15 years ago. Sam was 70 years old now, silver haired, still sharp as a filed chisel, and when I called him that evening and told him what had happened, he was quiet for a long moment before he said, "Walter, I want you to come to my office tomorrow morning, and I want you to bring absolutely nothing to that meeting except yourself and that key. Don't tell your kids. Don't tell anyone. Not yet." "Why not?" I asked, though I already half knew the answer. "Because," Sam said, "the moment your family finds out there's real money involved, this stops being about grief and starts being about war. And you want to know exactly what you're standing on before that war starts, not after." We went back to Colonial Trust and Savings together 3 days later on a Friday morning, Sam in a gray suit that had seen better decades, Diane Marsh waiting for us at a side entrance so we would not have to walk through the lobby. Two bank officers accompanied us into the vault. A room colder and quieter than I expected, rows of small steel doors set into the wall like the drawers of some enormous filing cabinet built for secrets instead of paper. Diane inserted her master key into one lock. I inserted Frank's rusted key into the other. Both turned at once, the mechanism releasing with a sound like a held breath, finally let go, and box 214 slid free. The vault smelled faintly of steel and dust, and my hands were not entirely steady as I turned my half of the lock, which surprised me because I had spent 4 decades handling machinery far more dangerous than a safe deposit box without so much as a tremor. Sam stood a step behind me, silent, giving me the room a good lawyer knows how to give a client at a moment like that, and Diane Marsh stood beside the wall of steel doors with a clipboard pressed to her chest, watching not the box, but me. The way you watch someone stepping onto ice you are not yet certain will hold their weight. Inside, wrapped in a canvas bank pouch and a manila folder gone soft with age, we found the deed to a commercial property on the east side of the city. A block of storefronts and offices Frank had quietly purchased under a holding company 19 years earlier and never once mentioned to a single member of our family, currently valued, according to the paperwork inside, at just over $1.1 million and generating rental income of $14,000 a month. We found a separate folder containing 42 gold coins, Krugerrands, and American Eagles, individually sleeved and inventoried in Frank's own handwriting on a yellow legal pad worth roughly $98,000 at that morning's spot price. And beneath all of it, in a sealed envelope with my name written on the front in Frank's unmistakable, slanted hand, we found a letter. Sam suggested I wait to read it privately, and I did. That night, alone at my kitchen table, with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. I will not tell you every word of what my brother wrote, because some things belong only to the two of us, but I will tell you the part that mattered most. Frank wrote that he had watched Derek over the final 2 years of his illness, ask questions no dying man should have to field from his own nephew. Questions about which properties Frank owned, whether he had protected his assets, whether Frank had thought about who would manage things after he was gone. He wrote that he had said nothing to me about it while he was alive because he did not want to poison whatever time I had left with my son over a suspicion he could not yet prove. But he wrote that he had watched me, his whole life, be the brother who showed up, who gave without counting, who let himself be taken for granted by people who mistook his patience for an absence of pride. And he had decided, quietly, in a hospital bed, that if his instincts about Derek were right, he was not going to let that boy get anywhere near what Frank had spent 40 years building. "The key isn't a joke, Walt," he wrote. "It's a test. Anyone who laughs at a rusty key doesn't deserve what's behind it. I trusted you'd be the one who didn't laugh. I sat at that table for a long time after I finished reading. Then I folded the letter back into its envelope and I began, very quietly and very deliberately, to plan. The countermove came first, before the reveal, because I had learned enough from 41 years of watching machines fail to know that you never announce a repair before you've secured the parts. With Sam's help, I placed the commercial property and the gold into a irrevocable trust, structured so that the assets could not be touched, borrowed against, or contested by anyone outside the terms Frank and I set together on paper. Terms that named specific charitable beneficiaries alongside my daughter Marianne, who, unlike her brother, had never once asked me for a dollar in her adult life, and had, in fact, tried twice over the years to send me money when she thought I was struggling. Money I always refused. I updated my own will for the first time in 11 years, with Sam's careful guidance, in a way I will not detail here except to say that it reflected, with total honesty, exactly which of my children had shown up for me, and which had shown up for what I might leave behind. I opened a separate account, funded by 3 months of the property's rental income, that existed for one purpose only. Ruby's college fund, held in a structure Derek and Christine could never access or borrow against, because whatever quarrel I now had with my son, I was not going to let it fall on a 9-year-old girl who still, on the rare occasions I saw her, ran halfway to the door before remembering. She wasn't supposed to seem too eager. Sam and I met 4 more times over the following 3 weeks, always at his office, never at mine, because he did not want any paper trail of documents arriving at my house where Derek or Christine might happen to see an envelope on the counter and start asking the kind of careful questions they had already grown so practiced at asking. We worked through the trust language line by line, Sam reading each clause aloud the way he must have read contracts to skeptical union men decades earlier, slowly, patiently, making sure I understood not just what each sentence said, but what it would mean 10 or 20 years from now in the hands of a family that might not always agree with the choices I was making today. A good trust, he told me once, leaning back in his chair with his glasses pushed up into his silver hair, isn't built to punish anybody, Walter. It's built to outlast your own good intentions on your softest day. You might forgive Derek everything 6 months from now. That's fine. That's human. But the trust doesn't forgive on your behalf unless you tell it to, in writing, with your eyes open. That's what protects Ruby's future, even if you go soft again in a year. I thought about that phrase for a long time after I left his office. Go soft again. Because it was not unkind, and it was not wrong, and it described exactly the man I had been for most of my adult life, the man who gave without counting, the man my own family had learned, patiently, to rely on. And then, because Frank's letter had planted one more seed in me that I could not shake, I did something I am not entirely proud of, though I do not regret it. I asked Sam to quietly review, on my behalf, the mortgage documents and the joint account statements I had co-signed for Derek and Christine 3 years earlier. It took him 11 days. What he found confirmed the thing I had been refusing to fully see for longer than I wanted to admit. Derek had not simply struggled to make his mortgage payments. He had been paying the minimum on that house while funneling nearly $900 a month into a separate account Christine controlled. One that had, over 3 years, accumulated enough to fund a boat they'd bought 18 months ago and a family cruise to the Bahamas I had heard about only afterward, in passing, as though it were nothing. My $620 a month had not been keeping my son afloat. It had been subsidizing a lifestyle he did not want to fund himself while he let his own father believe he was drowning. I did not confront him with any of it immediately. I let 3 more weeks pass, ordinary weeks, weeks in which Derek called twice, both times to ask, carefully, gently, whether I'd heard anything more from Uncle Frank's lawyer and whether there was anything to sort out on my end. I told him, both times, that the estate was complicated and I was still working through it with counsel, which was, in its narrow way, entirely true. I let Christine post on the family group chat a photograph of Ruby's new tablet, purchased, she noted cheerfully, with a little help from Grandpa's inheritance news. A sentence that told me everything about what my family had already decided, in their minds, belonged to them before I had said a single word about it. 2 days after that, Derek called and, in the middle of a conversation that started out about nothing in particular, asked whether I'd started looking at properties. Meaning, I understood only later whether I might be interested in upgrading his word into something newer, something that would presumably free up equity for exactly the kind of family help he had already grown accustomed to receiving. I told him I hadn't decided anything yet, which was true in the narrowest sense, and I listened to the small, satisfied pause on the other end of the line, the sound of a man who believes he has already won an argument nobody else knows they're having. I drove past the property on the east side of the city on a Wednesday afternoon, alone, without telling Sam or anyone else I was going. I sat in my car across the street for the better part of an hour, looking at the storefronts Frank had quietly owned for 19 years without a single member of our family knowing. A laundromat, a small accounting office, a nail salon, a bakery with a hand-painted sign that had clearly been there since before I retired. I watched people go in and out, carrying their ordinary lives in and out of a building my brother had built in complete privacy, telling no one, protecting it from exactly the kind of scrutiny and expectation he must have known, even then, that our family would eventually bring to it. I understood, sitting in that car, why Frank had never told me. It was not distrust of me specifically. It was the accumulated wisdom of a man who had watched, at a slight distance, the same pattern I was only now allowing myself to see up close. A family that had quietly learned to treat generosity as an entitlement rather than a gift. I called the family together on a Sunday in June at my house, the house Evelyn and I built our life inside of, the house Christine liked to call an asset. I told them it was to finally discuss Frank's estate and settle some questions about what had been left to me. Derek arrived first, in good spirits, wearing a new watch I did not recognize. Christine came with him, and Ruby and my daughter Marianne flew in the night before and stayed at my house rather than a hotel, which I noticed and which I think she meant for me to notice. I made coffee. I set out the good cups, the ones Evelyn kept for company. And when everyone was seated at the same table where, 3 weeks after Frank's funeral, my son had once laughed at a rusty key, I told them the truth, in full, calmly, without raising my voice a single time. I told them about the safe deposit box. I told them about the property, the $14,000 a month it generated, the gold, the trust I had already established with Sam's help. I watched Derek's face move through disbelief, then something closer to hunger, before I continued, and told them about the trust structure. The beneficiaries, the protections, the fact that none of it could be touched, borrowed, or contested. I watched that hunger curdle into confusion, and then, as I kept talking, into something closer to fear. "There's something else," I said, and I laid the mortgage documents Sam had pulled together on the table in front of Derek, page by page, the transfers, the dates, the boat, the cruise. "I want you to explain this to me. Not to Sam. Not to a judge. To me, your father." The man who signed his name next to yours on a loan so you wouldn't lose your house while you were quietly moving money I gave you into an account I didn't know existed. The room went very still. Christine's face had gone the color of old paper. Ruby, sensing something adult and dangerous in the air the way children always do, slid off her chair and went to stand by the window, looking out at nothing in particular. Christine broke first, the way I somehow already knew she would. "This is insane," she said, her voice climbing fast. "You're going to blow up this whole family over a boat? Over one cruise? Do you have any idea what it's like, living paycheck to paycheck while everyone acts like we're?" She stopped herself, but not soon enough, because everyone at that table heard the sentence she didn't finish, the one that would have ended with, "acted like we're doing fine," and everyone at that table understood, in that moment, that the mortgage checks had never been about survival at all. Derek said almost nothing for a long time. He sat very still, staring at the documents, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet in a way I had not heard from him since he was a boy of 9, standing in the principal's office, caught in a lie he told so smoothly that even he seemed surprised, in the end, that it hadn't worked. "Dad," he said, "I never meant for it to. I was going to pay you back once things stabilized. I swear, I never." He stopped. He looked at his own hands on the table. "I didn't think you'd ever find out." "That's the part that troubles me most," I told him. And I meant it, and I said it as gently as I could manage. Because some part of me, the part that had held his hand at every emergency room visit of his childhood, still loved him, even sitting across a table of evidence that he had been lying to me for 3 straight years. "Not that you needed help. I would have given you help, Derek. I always did, gladly, without keeping score. What troubles me is that you decided, somewhere along the way, that I was someone to be managed rather than someone to be honest with. Your uncle saw that in you before I let myself see it. That's why he left me a key instead of leaving anything directly to you. He was protecting me from exactly this conversation, and I am sorry it took me this long to understand what he already knew." Marianne, who had said nothing through all of it, reached over and put her hand on my arm, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly at the simple, uncomplicated weight of it. A daughter's hand offered without calculation, without an agenda underneath it. Christine gathered Ruby's coat and said they were leaving, that this had all gotten completely out of proportion, that I was punishing them for one mistake. Derek did not immediately follow her to the door. He stood in my kitchen a moment longer, looking, for once in a very long time, like the boy I remembered rather than the man he had become, and he said, quietly, "I don't know how to fix this." "You start," I told him, "by telling me the truth from now on, even when it costs you something. That's the only repair that ever mattered to me. Not the money. The truth." I did not tell him he was cut off from my life. I am not that kind of man, and Frank did not raise me to be. But I told him, plainly, that the trust stood as written, that the college fund for Ruby stood as written, that I loved him and would go on loving him. But that trust, once broken this thoroughly, does not repair itself on my schedule or his. It repairs itself slowly, through years of small, honest choices, or it does not repair itself at all, and which of those 2 paths we walked would be entirely up to him. He left that day angrier than I had seen him in years, and for the better part of 2 months he did not call. Christine did not either. I will not pretend that silence didn't cost me something. Some nights more than others, sitting alone in the house Evelyn and I built, wondering if I had done the right thing or simply the honest one, and whether those were always the same thing in the end. There were evenings in July when I sat at that same kitchen table with the good cups still drying in the rack from the day of the reveal, and I let myself wonder whether Frank, wherever he was, would have told me to go easier, to bend a little sooner, to let the boy save face in front of his wife. But then I would remember the sound of Derek laughing at a rusty key 3 weeks after his uncle's funeral, and the memory steadied me the way a level steadies a shelf. Not comfortable, exactly, but true. Marianne called every week during those 2 months, sometimes just to talk about nothing, the weather, a book she was reading, and I understood, without either of us saying it directly, that she was checking to see whether the silence from her brother was wearing me down, and quietly making sure it wasn't wearing me down alone. My old friend George, who I still see most Thursdays for coffee at the diner on Route 9, told me once during that stretch that he thought I'd done exactly the right thing, and then added, in the blunt way George has always talked to me since we were 19 years old working the same line together. "You spent your whole life being the fella nobody had to worry about, Walt. Maybe it's all right if you're a little bit of a worry to somebody, for once, if it means they finally have to be honest with you." I thought about that for days afterward. Slowly, carefully, something began to shift. Derek called in August, on Ruby's birthday, not to ask for anything, but simply to tell me She'd asked if Grandpa was coming to her party. I went. I brought a gift I had chosen myself rather than something Christine had suggested I buy, and Ruby ran to the door the way she used to. And for one afternoon at least, none of us mentioned keys or trusts or boats, and it felt, briefly, like enough. Christine was polite but distant that day, and I did not push for more than politeness, because I had learned, finally, that you cannot force a person to arrive at honesty on your timetable. Only make it clear that the door stays open for whenever they're ready to walk through it. Derek and I have spoken more since then. Not every week, not the way it used to be before all of this, but real conversations. A few of them, where he has told me things about his finances, his worries, his own fear that he had somehow become a man he didn't recognize, that I don't think he would have told me a year earlier. I do not know yet whether that repair will hold. I only know that it is being built now on something sturdier than the silence we mistook for peace before. I think often about the difference between the family I thought I had and the family I actually have, and I have come to believe those two things are rarely as far apart as they seem in the moment of discovery. They are simply revealed at different speeds to different people, depending on how badly those people need to keep believing the comfortable version. My brother Frank spent his final 2 years watching my son with a clarity I could not yet afford myself, because a father's love is a slower, more forgiving kind of sight than an uncle's, and there is no shame in that. What I have learned, in the months since that key turned in its lock, is that dignity is not the absence of being wounded by the people you love. It is what you do with your hands and your voice in the hour after the wound becomes visible. Whether you rage or collapse, or, like a man who has spent 41 years reading the smallest signs of failure in a machine before it breaks entirely, you simply, quietly, calmly begin to fix what can still be fixed and let go, without cruelty, of what cannot. I think, too, about Evelyn and what she would have made of all this. She had a saying she used to pull out whenever one of the kids tried to talk their way around something they'd done wrong, back when they were small enough that the stakes were nothing bigger than a broken lamp or a skipped chore. The truth doesn't need you to raise your voice, she'd say, crouching down to their eye level, calm as still water. It just needs you to stop changing the subject. I did not raise my voice at that kitchen table in June, not once, and I believe that was the thing that finally reached Derek, more than the documents, more than the number on the deed. He had spent 3 years, maybe longer, bracing for the version of this conversation where his father screamed at him, disowned him, made it easy for him to feel like the wronged party in his own deception. What he got instead was quiet and documents laid out like a man reading a gauge, and a father who still, even then, refused to change the subject away from love simply because love had been disappointed. There is a particular loneliness that comes with being the reliable one in a family, the one nobody worries about, the one whose calls are answered last because everyone assumes he is fine. He is always fine. He has always been fine. I lived inside that loneliness for years without fully naming it, right up until a rusty key and a locked bank door forced me to ask myself a question I had been avoiding for a very long time. Not whether I loved my family enough, because I always had, but whether I had ever once demanded, clearly and without apology, that they extend me the same honesty I had always extended them. Frank asked that question for me, in the end, from a hospital bed, in a letter he wrote when he had almost nothing left except the clarity that comes to people who are running out of time and have decided to spend what remains of it protecting the people who protected them. Some nights I still take that rusty key out of the drawer where it sits now, beside Evelyn's wedding ring and a photograph of Frank and me as boys on Corliss Street, grinning gap-toothed in front of a car neither of us was old enough to drive. I turn it over in my fingers the way Diane Marsh once did, and I think about how close I came to letting it sit forgotten for a lifetime, dismissed by the very laughter that should have told me, instantly, exactly how much it was worth. If there is a lesson in this for you, and I suspect there is, since you have stayed with me this long, it is this. The people who laugh at what looks worthless are very often telling you, without meaning to, exactly how little they understood you to begin with. Do not let their laughter rush you into proving anything. Take your time. Find your Sam Petrosky, your Diane Marsh, the quiet, careful people who will stand beside you while you figure out what you're actually holding. And trust that the ones who truly love you were never counting the dollars in the first place. They were only ever waiting to see who you'd become on the other side of finding out the truth. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? And from where in the world are you listening? I read every message, and you mean more to me than you know. For more stories like this one, like this video, and subscribe. There is so much more waiting for you. With love and respect. Until next time.